what is consent?
Yes, consent is such an important conversation. It's really the root and foundation of not only sexuality, but intimacy, understanding people's values. Consent, I would say, is a mutual agreement between all parties involved in any activity. It could be sexual, it could be physical activities, any social connection. And that agreement is about what's going to be happening in that situation or scenario. So, for example, in sexual consent, it would involve an understanding of what's going to happen in that event of activity or connection. And I like to remember this acronym for consent around sex called FRIES, which means that it's freely given, it's revocable and also reversible. It's informed, which means we know what we're saying yes to. Also, that there is excitability. That doesn't mean we're jumping up and down saying yes, excited, but that we're genuinely interested and it's something that we desire, as well as it's specific. It's not something that feels broad or vague, and we aren't understanding exactly what that is that we are engaging in. So, consent is also not just one conversation, it's an ongoing and evolving communication between all consenting adults.
Not very well said. I love that. I love the FRIES acronym. I'm going to try and remember that. And you said that it's a mutual agreement. So is it something that has to be, forgive me if this sounds like a stupid question. Does this have to be down in writing? Does it have to be verbalized? How is this agreement made? Could it be non-verbal? Could it be without writing it down?
That's actually a great question. So, some people like to have an actual written agreement. That way, it's clearly stated in their words what it is that they're saying yes to or agreeing to for that type of play or activity. For many, it's a verbal agreement, or it starts out as conversations before play, during play, and even after any play or activity. So, it can happen in many forms. I think what we don't want to do is assume consent. For example, there was a nod or body language, or you sort of said, sure, yes, we want to make sure that it's very clear. Clear communication means that there's mutual understanding. We check in with the person. Does this mean you're comfortable with this? Does this still feel okay for you? So it's something that we can feel open to continue asking and checking in around. And I would also say the language is important. We want to make sure we are clear on how we are being informed around what we're giving consent to, and also what we're hearing back, that we can repeat that back and say, is this a clear yes from you? Does this feel okay?
Hmm. Hmm. And you mentioned that consent can be revoked. So does that mean if, for example, a couple's, I mean, they've agreed that they're going to engage in sexual activity, and then during the encounter, one of the partners, for whatever reason, I mean, are they allowed to revoke that consent? And if so, how would the other person know?
Exactly. That's a really good point. And it's a touchy subject because there's a lot of misunderstanding around that. But yes, that means that we're continually checking in. And if we want to pay attention and be present during our sexual encounters. So if someone is starting out with an enthusiastic yes and something changes and shifts, that's normal to happen. Things come up, we get triggered and overwhelmed, or emotions can arise. So we want to pay attention to what we're noticing and not assume anything. I always say if it hasn't been spoken, it doesn't exist. Be clear on what you're noticing, be curious. It is, if we think about it, sex and intimacy is a partnership connection, it's about relationships. So checking in should be something that we normalize, and don't assume anything that might make someone feel unsafe or uncomfortable in that situation. And if the consent is being revoked from the other partner and you're the one hearing that, make sure that that makes sense and understanding. What is it that you're feeling uncomfortable with? It could be maybe certain parts or elements, or maybe needing to take a pause or a break to check in with one another and talk about what's going on. It's important that we have a process for consent that doesn't feel overwhelming, or it's healthy vulnerability.
Mhm. And has attitudes changed towards consent since you've started, doing your work? I'm just wondering over the last, because there's a lot of conversation I've noticed around consent the last like 5 to 10 years. I'm wondering how attitudes were towards consent maybe, I don't know, 15, 20 years ago.
I think there's a lot of fear around consent, of not being prepared for those moments like we just discussed, right? If there's a misunderstanding or if we don't know how to communicate, or give that feedback. And I think the conversations are changing a lot as well because we're seeing more media coverage and topics about violations of consent and how important it is to understand consent on all levels, even outside of sexual intimacy. Consent can be important in the workplace, any big decision that we're making in our life. So it's definitely broadening our conversation around consent, but also people are wanting skills. I want to be able to be clear on what consent is. I want the communication skills. I want to know how to navigate those uncomfortable moments if something were to come up.
And what age would you advise someone to learn about consent? Is it just before they get into relationship? Is it when they're a child? When should people understand what is consent?
I would say as early as possible. I mean, if we're thinking about childhood, we're talking a lot about consent with children now around touch and what's appropriate and comfortable for a child, even if they're receiving a hug or praise or any communication that may feel uncomfortable. So I think there's consent that should be discussed at every stage of our life. Obviously, when we get into intimate relationships, there are whole new layers of consent to talk about when we navigate intimacy and sex and relationships and boundaries. So obviously, I would say consent conversations based on where that person is in their development and what types of situations they're going to encounter in their social life.
And this brings me to another term that I was recently made aware of. Consensual non-consent, CNC, that's popped up over the last
Yes.
year or so. Well, in terms of in my radar, can you help explain what that is?
Yes, I would say consensual non-consent or CNC is a type of erotic play where there can actually be role play around non-consensual situations, but done safely and contained in an environment where there is communication beforehand and negotiation and agreements beforehand, even safe words and aftercare. For some people, this is kind of edgy. They may say, why would anyone want to role play a non-consensual situation? For many, it can be erotically thrilling to have a psychological experience where something that might feel risky or kind of edgy in that particular way be in a contained and healing dynamic with another person that you trust and that you can have even a corrective or healing experience from something that may have been traumatic before. So it's more popular, prevalent in more of the kink community, but I see even a lot of conventional couples now playing with this dynamic in order to build trust and openness around dynamics of play and communication where there has to be this relational mutual understanding. So I think the kink community can demonstrate healthy sexuality better than any other community because of the process that they go through. Discussion, communication before anything is ever initiated, making sure that everyone is feeling safe and comfortable, having ways to navigate that play scenario so that everyone can continue giving consent throughout that experience. So it can sometimes be a good model for how some people can heal or work through trust issues, betrayal, or traumas that have shown up around sex and intimacy.